A huge election year is here, and yet the lines aren't drawn. Why can't we get the redistricting completed? Meanwhile, James Craig watches election cycle dreams crash again. And the CDC prepares to adjust the advice for what to do when you get COVID. Today is Sunday, March 18, 2024, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. Last week, we marked the one-year anniversary of the shooting at Michigan State University. No school on Tuesday of last week because it still feels very fresh in our minds, in the minds of the students and faculty. And yet, it's so routine. We are averaging a mass shooting every day so far this year. And the day after the MSU anniversary, on Valentine's Day, gunfire broke out in Kansas City as they had gathered to celebrate the Chiefs' Super Bowl win. And here in the middle of this very key election year, as I was texting with my many friends and family in Kansas City, it dawned on me that while we've heard plenty of stump talk about immigration and Ukraine and Russia and electric vehicles, I don't know that I've heard the candidates talk about what we're going to do about America's mass shooting problem. Maybe we're just throwing up our hands. Now, maybe that will change as we move along the campaign trail, a trail that is still without a great map to follow in Michigan. Coming up this morning, why we're struggling to create new voting districts in this state. We're going to talk with 3 members of the Redistricting Commission. We're also going to talk about a couple of interesting political developments this week. Former Detroit Police Chief James Craig drops out of the U.S. Senate race despite being one of the leaders in our latest poll. And early on, the home quarantine advice was 10 days if you had COVID. Then it went to 5. Now, another change coming. What does it tell us about life with COVID in 2024? It's all today on Flashpoint. All right, we are 5 years into what to many seem like a genuine grassroots approach to redrawing electoral districts in Michigan that could be a national model. But it has been a bumpy road, and some have suggested that the virtue of the approach, turning to non-politicians and allowing everyday Michiganders to do the work, has been its chief problem. It is a matter of no small consequence in this big election year and given the razor-thin margins in the Michigan legislature. We're going to talk about it with 3 members of the Michigan Redistricting Commission. Democrat Brittany Kellum is here. Republican Marcus Muldoon is here, and so is Independent Rebecca Zatella. Thank you all very much for being here. The Judge Kethledge, Rebecca, I want to start with you, characterized the work of the commission so far as a mixture of defiance and disarray. You've been in the middle of a lot of the dust-ups, calling for the removal of some members, and they've in turn asked for your removal. What's been the problem, do you think?
So I don't see it as a problem. I think that's democracy, and democracy is sometimes people disagreeing, and that's exactly what you see on this commission, is we have people who disagree, often heatedly, and ultimately we reach a resolution, but I don't see it as a bad thing. I think that disagreement and conflict is normal.
You recently, though, you wanted protection from retribution. That's not a good thing.
No, I don't think that's a good thing to have to ask for that. But you know, like I said, democracy can be kind of messy.
I love the noise of democracy. I believe it was James Buchanan that said that. Brittany, what's your take on what has been at the heart of the failure to get all this tidied up and done? Because we're now into this, as I said, for 5 years, 2 years past what people hoped it would take.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the underdog. I love second chances, and I think the commission is doing exactly that. We heard one voice from Detroiters and the citizens, and we are not politicians. We are regular folk who work, grandparents, retired, whatever. You know, we run the gamut of experience. So I think this opportunity to empower and to fix disenfranchised communities, especially as a native Detroiter, is amazing. And it gets us at a second chance to re-engage and do it over again.
Because there were 13 districts that have been called into question, all of them in Southeast Michigan, right?
So, yes, we are redoing Southeast Michigan. We are, of course, including communities of interest in other cities that are just outside of the Detroit borders, but all in the name of getting it right so we can get these house maps done in a way that makes native Detroiters proud.
Marcus, I mentioned the virtue of this, we thought, was having a lot of non-politicians doing this, and yet you all had to turn to advice from sort of political experts experts, legal advice on how to proceed. And so I guess, and I think a lot of the members of the commission, you feel like you were misled or led astray by that legal advice early on, right?
I wasn't part of it at that time.
At the time, right.
Replacement afterwards, but it seems that, yeah, there was some misadvice and trying to work past that.
So the judge has sounded dubious as to whether or not the commission is up to fixing the problems. Where do you feel like the commission is at the moment?
I think the we've done a good job together collaboratively addressing the issues and remapping, and we've issued 9 new maps and 1
right.
Independent map.
Rebecca, it seems to me that I've always said that there's 2 kinds of discrimination. There's paying too much attention to race and not paying any attention to race. That's a fine line that you all are somehow trying to walk here on these districts, right?
Yes, we're walking on a tightrope to some degree, trying to balance between drawing fair districts, but not using race too much, not letting it predominate, but not also ignoring it. So it's been a bit of a challenge. Your
take on what's been going on with the... That's been the criticism as soon as those first maps came out, was that a whole bunch of Southeast Michigan black voters were being disenfranchised.
Yeah, I think that's a good reason, right? I think that black Detroiters have all sorts of reasons, black folks all over, why they would have reason to not trust a political process, because there are historical accounts, and they are right, not just accounts, of people getting things wrong and stamping out communities of color. So I think this, again, is our chance to do it over and to make sure that we're addressing the communities that have said that they wanted to be together and why, and it gives us another chance to, no matter where we come from as commissioners, to really plug in and lean into the discomforts that tend to circle around race and community. So I think that it's a bold choice. No, we can't draw, using race. However, Detroit is a predominantly black city, so we're drawing in the spirit of keeping that in mind, in the spirit of knowing how these lines really impact communities.
Well, it's a really interesting thing. I'm curious about your approach to the way you're thinking about this. Marcus, if I've got a big area here and it happens to have the population in it, which means it needs to be split into 2 districts, what would be the defining line of where we split those 2 in half?
By the communities of interest, the communities that work together to try and keep the communities' interest together for each part of that area.
That's difficult to drill down on, isn't it? I mean, how do I know what one neighbor thinks versus the person across the street?
Absolutely, and it makes it difficult because you will get where some people say their area belongs with one, and then the person next door to them says, no, I think it belongs with another. So it kind of got to take a general consensus and go with the most input.
Rebecca, give me your thumbnail on how these decisions should be made.
So we actually received almost 30,000 comments in 2021. And we did, before drawing our first round of maps, we kind of consolidated and talked about what information we had received and what community of interest we thought were important. And then we worked on incorporating those into our maps. And so you saw some of that same process this time around, where we were using that same information we already had, things we had already identified as important, like the Latino community and Banglatown and just different communities that we tried to keep together this round. So by structuring the maps around communities of interest, you can come up with good districts without focusing so much on things that we're not supposed to be focusing on.
Your thoughts on how we make those decisions?
Yeah, I would have
The line has to go somewhere, right?
It does, but our central focus and what we're charged with doing is drawing communities and drawing maps that reflect the communities that are coming out and talking. So even if they're not speaking in the way that we understand, because we've been immersed in the process, right? We have to understand the software. We have to understand all the criterion. We have to learn how to listen in a way where we can have that show up in the maps. So it's park, it's riverways, it is understanding the cities and neighborhood frameworks and names for all of those things. And it's about re-engaging. If we're not hearing what we need to hear, then we come out to the public and we say, Detroiters, we need to hear more. And we do need to hear more from Detroiters. Yeah. So I think it is about communities of interest, and then measuring that against population, demographics, partisan fairness, all the other things that we have to draw when we're drawing these House and Senate maps.
Yeah. The last question, I don't know who wants to weigh in on this, but you've all heard the criticism that you're costing too much money, that this has gone way past, it's a hefty budget, but you've gone a couple of years past what we thought it was going to be, people continuing to draw $40,000 salaries for this work that was supposed to be done. Anybody want to take a whack at?
Well, I think fairness is expensive. I think that we have, in society and in this country, we've done a lot of expensive things that were unfair and unjust. And I think this expense weighs in on the voters' opportunity to have citizens and not politicians redraw these maps. So it's experimental, it's fun, it's painful at times, but I think it's worth it ultimately, that citizens will be proud.
We hope so. We continue. Obviously, there's so much at stake in the work you're doing. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it, and good luck going forward. Yeah. We come back. We'll talk about the new advice that is evolving from the CDC on what to do if you get COVID. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Welcome back. We knew the COVID path would evolve. Remember, it was originally 10 days staying at home if you had a positive test. That then changed to 5. Well, now word has come that the CDC is going to change that guidance again and build it really around symptoms rather than around test results. Let's talk that over with Local 4's medical expert, our fortunate to have on staff, Dr. Frank McGeorge. Talk to me a little bit about why we would start evolving our advice on this. And it has not gone into effect yet.
Right, yeah, this is a plan. So, right. I think this was the natural evolution of where COVID was going to go. Way back when the pandemic was really hot and heavy, people were saying, well, are we going to be like this forever? Right. And the answer then was, well, I guess we'll have to see. Well, we're at that point now where we've seen COVID has evolved. It is less dangerous. We now have much more natural and vaccine-provided immunity among all the people in the community. So the need to protect people as broadly as we did in the very beginning is actually very different now. So this is the natural evolution of the way we need to protect ourselves from a public health standpoint.
Do you feel like COVID has changed in the way that it affects us, or have we developed a more robust immunity to it?
I'm fairly certain that actually we have developed a more robust immunity to it. In a population, if you were to create a new population of humans that have never seen COVID before and you expose them to today's version of COVID, it would probably have the same effect as old COVID did to us back in the day. Yeah. So the vaccines and the immunity that we've had from our passive exposures in the community have actually, I think, benefited us greatly. And again, changed the trajectory of COVID for all of us.
So what we expect the CDC to do here, probably next month, is to advise that we'll start looking at it the way we do the flu, for example. If you got a fever, don't go to work, stay home.
Exactly. The whole idea is it's symptom-based, so you want to wait until your symptoms resolve and your fever resolves for at least 24 hours, and at that point, you can go back to work. Now, that doesn't mean that COVID is gone. It doesn't mean COVID is over. You still have to be intelligent about it. If you're going back to work, it would be smart to stay away from your closest colleagues. It would be smart to maybe even wear a mask yourself to prevent other people from getting your sort of passively excreted virus if you still have some for basically, a handful of days after you are even fever-free. But the level of concern that we have about widespread community activity is lower now. But I have to admit, certain populations, immunocompromised, elderly, those are specific groups that if you work with closely, you should take extra precautions.
Or have them in your household.
Exactly. Yeah. And maybe continue to stay home longer, or if they're in your household, protect them with masks or protect yourself from infecting them.
So if I start to feel sick, does it do me much good now to take a COVID test?
It's definitely different. Clearly the fact that, it's no longer an emergency, the CDC no longer tracks the numbers like they used to. Yeah. And along those lines, testing does have a different implication because, as you say, if you test and you test positive, does it mean that I'm going to do anything different than, let's say, I had the flu? If I had the flu and I had a fever, I would stay home until my fever was gone. So yes, I think it has a different implication, but the biggest caution I would say is if you, again, are elderly, immunocompromised, somebody that would benefit from Paxlovid in particular, knowing you had COVID is actually a super valuable thing because there is a treatment for it.
I guess we would also worry about people falling asleep at the switch and feeling like this is all done, because we did watch COVID morph. It did evolve into the Delta variant, which didn't mean that it was becoming less dangerous. It became more dangerous for a while there.
Right. So there's transmissibility and there's basically pathogenicity or danger level. So each iteration, each new variant has actually become more transmissible. That's actually how it spreads so widely, because it is more easily spread. But that does not mean it is more dangerous to us. And part of the biggest reason is it's not as dangerous because we have immunity to it. Yeah. Even though we don't have immunity to that variant, which makes it more spreadable, transmissible, we are better protected.
Lastly, a worrisome side effect, I think, of what we watched people do with vaccines and the COVID vaccine, we've actually watched measles cases kind of creep up in the country right now.
Right.
That's trouble.
Well, absolutely. And I think this is where public health needs to be smart about the advice we give, in the sense that you don't want people to be vaccine fatigued, to be vaccine angry, to be vaccine hesitant. You need people to understand vaccines are your friends. They're good. They're there to help. Yeah. And the measles vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, and other vaccines have suffered partly from COVID pushback against vaccines. That, unfortunately, was just a byproduct that happened because we needed the COVID vaccines when we needed them. But now it's time for us to be more sensible about the way we, again, inform people about the value and importance of vaccines.
And do I assume now that I need to treat the COVID vaccine like I do the flu vaccine every year?
Yeah, probably. I mean, we don't really know exactly the full trajectory of COVID long term, but at this point it does look like it's going to continue to mutate from year to year a little bit. And so it will probably be like the flu, where there will be a new vaccine introduced periodically, whether it will be annually, or every couple of years, not clear yet.
As always, so grateful for your expertise, Frank. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Frank McGeorge. We come back, we'll talk a little politics with our pollster, Richard Zuba. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Welcome back. We had a number of interesting political developments that occurred last week. The Senate field for that open Senate seat in Michigan shrunk by one rather notable name. We also saw the Democrats take a seat in Congress that had been held by a Republican. I talked about both those things with our pollster from the Glenn Gariff Group, Richard Zuba, earlier last week.
Richard, I want to start with the latest news on James Craig, who always, when he was running for governor, seemed to poll pretty well. Our most recent poll that you did for us in the Detroit News had him as actually the strongest candidate against Alyssa Slotkin in the Senate race, and he drops out.
Yeah, I mean, this is the second time that James Craig has been, leading the pack on the Republican side for a statewide office and failed to fire. I mean, the only way to describe James Craig at this point is he's politically impotent. He cannot get on the ballot. This is the most basic function of a candidate. So it doesn't matter how good your name ID is. If you can't get on the ballot, you're not a real candidate. And I think moving forward, we need to take that in consideration as we talk about him as a candidate.
He now talks about running for mayor. I guess the same problem will persist. High name recognition, but it takes more than that.
Right. Running for office is, takes some skills. The first skill is you get on the ballot. And if you can't get on the ballot, you're not a real candidate. And I think given that we've seen this failure to fire twice now on a statewide level, I think the third time we should all be highly suspicious. And the proof will be in the pudding.
For some people who are on the ballot, there are troubles developing, and that includes President Biden. We've already talked about quite a bit on the program about Arab Americans now deciding that they may just sit it out and their abandon Biden sort of campaign. But now we have the Our Revolution group, the group that was the Democratic group started by an independent, I should say, because it's Bernie Sanders. But they're trying to get Democrats in Michigan to vote uncommitted. Talk about the ramifications of that.
Well, Michigan has a long and storied history of sending messages at presidential primary times, whether it be, 2000 when John McCain upset George W. Bush, whether it be, Bernie Sanders winning in 2016, George Wallace in 1972, Jesse Jackson in 84. Michigan likes to send messages in its primaries. And I suspect the Biden team is very cognizant of that and very worried right now. This is going to be an early test for the Biden campaign of just how serious of a problem this is going to be for them in Michigan. And couple that with how big of a problem it's going to be for Democrats under 40, where we've seen there is a huge weakness for Biden. Do they coalesce together? You know, this group that's associated with Bernie Sanders supporting this effort, very interesting. And I think it's really going to be a signal moving forward.
Support for Biden could be similarly affected by a movement among some Democrats to cross over and vote for Nikki Haley to kind of upset the Republican apple cart.
You know, I think that stands less of a chance right now, given that we're seeing the uncommitted campaign occurring. If you're going to, you know, people like to send messages in their own party. They like to cross over when there's nothing going on. There's something going on the Democratic side. So I suspect there isn't going to be as big of a crossover as we might have seen in, for example, 2000 McCain-Bush race.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to make sure we touched on, we saw the Democrats were able to take the seat in New York that had been held by the very controversial George Santos. And I, of course, am always mindful that all politics is local. And yet we look for themes and maybe patterns. So I'm wondering whether you think that that was specifically just about the George Santos problem, and that was why Democrats were able to take that seat, or do we read a broader pattern into that?
Well, I do think we need to be careful on this race simply because the Democratic candidate had held the office before. He's highly well known. He was well positioned to win that seat, but he did win it by a margin bigger than most people thought would happen. And I think part of that is, you know, Democrats, the Republicans attacked him on immigration. And it was just at the time that the Republicans backed out of the immigration deal in Washington. And it allowed the Democrats to develop a narrative that the Republicans walked away from an immigration fix. And I suspect we're going to see a lot of Democrats using that issue more offensively than defensively as a result.
Can you see voters giving one side or the other the blame over this immigration thing, or is it simply a pox on both your houses that you couldn't get something done?
I think it's now a pox on both your houses. I mean, I just think it adds to the frustration voters have that just the most basic, negotiations and trying to reach a deal just can't happen anymore because everything is tied up in politics, and it just feeds the cynicism about the system.
Richard, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for the time.
You're welcome.
We will, of course, be relying more and more on pollster Richard Zuba as we head toward the primary, which is coming up here in just a little more than a week in Michigan. And then, of course, counting down to what we all expect is going to be a rather dramatic 2024 general election. That's going to do it for us this morning. Thanks so much for being here. Meet the Press is coming up next. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time right back here for Flashpoint.